allow me to welcome Professor Morten Jerven. Can you please introduce yourself?
I'm an economic historian with a PhD from London School of Economics. For 5 years I worked at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada. And currently I'm employed at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, which is in Norway.
And you are also the author of Poor Numbers, How We Are Less Misled by Statistics, and also this book, Africa, Why Economics is Wrong, published in 2015, about the presentation, the lecture you just delivered, and about your first book, Poor Numbers. So what are you saying about how African statistics are produced, and why are you saying that we need to question them?
My central point is that many users of data use these data uncritically and download them in international data sets, thinking that they are somehow functionally equivalent facts and gives us direct information or knowledge about the state of economic development and other conditions from African countries. Well, if you start asking who made this observation, under what conditions was this observation made, and is there any reason to think it's biased in any direction, you'll find that your level of knowledge actually behind these numbers is much lower. I used to say that there is in the data sets there are actually more gaps than there are observations. We have limited information on particularly smaller sized economic transactions on poorer part of the population. I like the informal sector. So I like to say, which I say in my book, is that poor numbers means that our knowledge is doubly biased. We know less about poor economies, and we know less about the poor people living in those poor economies. And that's a serious indictment if you think that World Bank and others are tasked with collecting development statistics precisely to help these people in these countries.
But what you are saying is that these data shouldn't be called data, they are at best guesstimates.
That's right.
What allows you to say that?
Well, I think that we are presented with a global database without gaps, where in fact many of these are not data as the word would mean, something that is given, but actually imputed, projected, guessed at, borrowed from one country to another. And so therefore if you start thinking about actually what is really there, you'll find that the reality and the numbers depart. And so that means that although we have this feeling that we can say things about countries we don't know anything about, we actually can't say anything about things we don't know anything about. The numbers themselves don't contain any knowledge, and therefore it's also not only dangerous to rely on them to make decisions, but also to use these numbers to try to run on statistical models to get some correlations about relationship with one variable to another.
And you conducted research in several countries such as Ghana, Uganda, Tanzania. If you were to take an example about the corruption and good governance data, what does it tell us? Yeah,
so corruption data is very different from GDP or inflation data in the sense that inflation or GDP measures some things that can actually be measured. So you can actually have a transaction in a market and you can get the price on it and you can count how many transactions there were. And then you can compare it with the one tomorrow and then find out whether prices are increasing or whether there is economic growth. We have a theory. So if I told you what inflation was, according to theory, that definition would enable you to go out and measure it. When it comes to democracy or corruption or governance, there are no such definitions that actually allow it. Just by knowing what a democracy might mean doesn't mean that you can measure it straight up. It's a little bit like the weather. Everyone can know what the weather is in some sense. But you can't say today it's 4.5. You can say something that it's 70 degrees. You can say it rained so and so many millimeters. You can multiply the two and say the weather is 252. It's just, weather is something that has to be experienced and understood in its context. And there might be missing variables that you don't multiply, like the wind strength, that somehow then makes it feel colder than it is, or the clothes you're wearing and so forth like that. So democracy or corruption is one of those things that is not very hard. It's very hard to measure, and then you are often rely on indicators or subjective perceptions or proxies, expert opinions to get those. Corruption is one of those where it's very hard to measure. So per definition, you can't just go ahead and get the information about it. And we know that if you use the index of saying, oh, I'm going to measure corruption as according to how many trials there were that found people guilty. If you made an index on that, you probably get an index that actually expressed how little corrupt countries were, because you're likely to, countries that take corruption seriously will prosecute corruption. So you don't know how the visible and the invisible relate to each other. So then you're based with getting some kind of outsider view to get some kind of perception of it. And then if we think that, for instance, people have more positive expectations about Sweden than they really should have, and more negative perceptions about Syria than they really should have. And not only that, if Sweden has a very bad 4 or 5 years of economic decline, it might mean that Swedish people or investors say, like, you know, the government officials in Sweden are so inefficient. And the same thing in Nigeria might have their perceptions of the government might change with economic decline or increase. That we find that people in Ghana are now suddenly more happy about the government from 2010 to 2012, where things were going very well, but now they think, oh, they're so corrupt again. And so therefore, if you try to make a correlation between either income or growth on the basis of this, you're getting what is reversal causality, that you might be picking up that economic decline makes people feel that they're more corrupt. But it might also go the other way as well, like in a more fundamental sense, that because there are economic decline, then politicians are more desperate and then do more corrupt things. That they don't see that, like we can see, for instance, in a public university or a policeman that is underfunded, he might be more likely to be corrupt about his degrees or his ticket fines because of economic decline. So how this enters into a discussion about the countries in the world are corrupt and therefore they're poor, or they're poor because they're corrupt, is very, very complicated to get that. And therefore I'm very, very hesitant to accept any kind of use of, for instance, of this subjective perception index to make decisions, to say, okay, this country is ranked 3.5, therefore we should give it money. This one is 3.7, therefore we should not. That would be to let these indicators enter into a legal discussion as an expert in witness without us having the ability to interrogate it. And that's what I encourage in my recent book and the previous data, we have to interrogate the numbers.
And that's what you say here, like correlation is not causation. And also we need to have a political economy approach to know who has interest, who counts, and who benefits from these statistics. So in this book, published in 2015, your aim is to document how the mainstream growth literature has misunderstood the growth performance of sub-Saharan Africa in the post-colonial era. So you argue that it would be wrong to celebrate the recent growth, Africa Rising narrative, as a triumph of economic and political liberalization. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, I think that the main engine of economic growth in sub-Saharan Africa was this time, and has been previously, external demand in external markets for particular African raw materials and exports. People approach Africa Rising as that's something new. We haven't seen that before. And that's a fundamental mistake that we're not learning from history. Growth has not been failed in Africa, it's been recurring. There's been massive periods of marked increase in the past. It's only ahistorical to not think that somehow they don't have the capacity to grow. It's rather we need to understand the political economy of growth, who benefits from this type of growth, and what determines it as well. And that's why one of the reasons one should be hesitant to accept the mainstream orthodox analysis, which said that in the 50s and 60s there was bad policies, in the 80s and 90s there was poor policies, good policies, and now it's finally growing again. Because the economic growth record suggests that there was growth in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. There was no growth in the 80s and the 90s. And now, yes, there is growth, but it would be, that's because of the external markets are improving again, not necessarily because policies are getting better. And it's also some of the evidence I review in there. It also shows that economies are now becoming more dependent on external demand than they have been before. So the external dependence has been increasing radically over the past 2 decades.
And you called the tendency of some of the economists to compare countries such as considered developmental states, for example, and African countries now, to say what is happening, why are they not growing, the so-called African demi. And you are saying we shouldn't have this subtraction, is it?
Yeah, subtraction approach.
Yeah. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, so the subtraction approach is to observe a poor country on the one hand and a rich country on the other hand, and then to find that what explains why the poor country isn't rich is all the ways it is different from the rich one. So you take the characteristics of a rich country and then you subtract those. And that means then you'll find that it has the wrong geography, it has the wrong politicians, it doesn't have the right ethnic homogeneity, and institutions and so forth. Then you just matches deficits with deficits. This is really not a good way to do social science. Anthony Hopkins, the economic historian of West Africa, published in 1973, he made this comment that trying to compare whether one geography or one institution is better or worse for growth is akin to trying to explain whose life is more difficult, penguins or camels. Well, you might ask yourself that, is it really more difficult to be a penguin or a camel? That would be a misleading question. Both penguins and camels are adaptations to a difficult condition. It wouldn't make sense to rank them from 1 to 5 and say that a camel is better than a penguin. And moreover, I think even more importantly, perhaps, is that if we let the camels rank penguins, they might have us. So you get subjective interpretation of the world. There is a tendency to always say that the reason why people are not as successful as us is that they are not like us. But that's then instituting the view that somehow the US or the West is the norm and everything else is a deviation. Yeah, so it's a deviation from the norm. So I'm encouraging research that lets Tanzania be the norm and Senegal to be the norm and other countries to be the deviations from that. Surely if we think that history is important, institutions is important, then analysis has to start in the country, not as a substitute. Yeah.
So, what can you tell us from this first day, this first session that you just had about corruption? I saw that there was a vibrant debate about the participants reflecting about their own country experience. So, what does it tell you? That people are interested in data and.
It's excellent.
Yeah.
I'm very encouraged. This first day was invigorating, as they say. I felt that a lot of the things that I brought up were picked up in the audience and then reevaluated in the context of their own country or their own practice or their own work or their own interest. And we got a lot of interest in discussing data in general that moved us into the discussions of governance, which we'll have tomorrow. So far so good, as they say.
That's great. And what is your next research or your next publication?
I'm advertising a vacancy on a PhD project. 4 years of funding for anyone who wants to do a PhD, or not anyone, the best one. The best candidate who wants to do a PhD on the politics of numbers. We're going to talk about why states count and what they not count and so forth like that, and how international organizations use and abuse numbers to make decisions.
Thank you so much, Professor Jerven.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure discussing with you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.